Let's begin exiting the A.S.A.P lane with Alan.
Hello, everyone. Now, this is Alan Steelman. And as you know from previous episodes, we always try to have an interesting and special guest. And today's guest is both special and very unique in several respects. Her message and her life story will inspire men and women everywhere. The role of women has evolved, yet the gender gap still remains in many respects, and I will ask our guest to elaborate on this further. My guest today is Debjani Biswas, an internationally best-selling author and a two-time TEDx speaker. She is an influential and powerful voice in bringing a message to both men and women about the business impact of inclusion and respect in the workplace. She has a unique combination of executive and corporate experience with 20-plus years at PepsiCo and Texas Instruments and education as a chemical engineer, an MBA, and an MS in organizational strategy. She is currently the chief executive and founder of Coachieve, LLC, which provides inclusion and leadership solutions for her clients. An Exclusion Exterminator, she delivers impactful keynotes to corporate and conference audiences on the business value of inclusion. She is the 2017 GDAACC Award in Journalism winner and a 2013 NAPW Woman of the Year. And may I add, very importantly, she is a walking, talking example of the adage and the lesson many of us have learned in life: when one door closes, another one can open. And I will ask her to elaborate on that later in the program. In her own case, her own life journey began with self-discovery in 2012, an experience that transformed her from a corporate executive into this internationally best-selling author that I just mentioned, a keynote speaker and a trusted advisor for CEOs and leaders around the world. Unleash the Power of Diversity was selected by Barnes & Noble in 2014. Miserably Successful No More was ranked number one in Amazon in the U.S. for its category and is an international bestseller. She serves on the board of her engineering organization, IIT-NT, and on the board of TIE Dallas, TIE. She is regularly featured in the media as a diversity expert on outlets such as ESPN, CBS, iHeartRadio, and the Dallas Morning News. Her groundbreaking and original frameworks are being utilized in over 20 countries. Welcome, Debjani, and thank you for taking the time to join us. I have heard you speak, and I know firsthand how important your message is, how powerful it is, and how compelling it is, not only for women, but for boys and men as well. So welcome, Debjani. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alan.
First, on this point of one door closing and another one opening, I know your personal story, our listeners do not, but elaborate on that and how that has led you to places that you never envisioned before, and to this place of being such an influential voice on this very important topic of gender inclusion.
Thank you so much for asking that, Alan. Exactly 7 years ago this month, I was laid off. And after the initial shock wore off, I just have not looked back. Our son asked, he said, "Mommy, you've wanted to write a book for the longest time. What are you waiting for?" Here we are, 7 years later, 3 books, and in the middle of the 4th book right now. I don't know, this journey, all the things that Alan mentioned happened because one door closed. And so that's what I would suggest to our listeners is if something happens, take it as a sign that you were meant to change directions.
Well, so many of us do have those experiences in life where either due to a downsizing or a blip in the economy, that employment door closes. So that's very inspiring to hear. Tell us just a bit about this current book you're working on. You've mentioned the other 3, did you say?
Yeah.
So this is number 4. Tell us just a bit about that.
So the one in between, the third one was #us2 that I did my 2 TED Talks on. And as I was doing that, I realized that there's 2 aspects to inclusion. And so the 4th one that I'm writing the manuscript is called A Bridge to Sanity. And the bridge is an acronym. It's BRIDGE. The BR and the I is about how you build and reinforce inclusion. So that's BRI. And the DGE of the bridge, so DGE has to do with destroying the guardrails of exclusion. So what I've discovered, it's not just enough to build and reinforce inclusion, because the person has to be in the room before you can include them. Destroying the guardrails of exclusion means recognizing stereotyping and bias when it happens and reducing exclusion before you can increase inclusion. So that's what I'm working on. It's a bridge to sanity, power inclusion in divided times.
And will this be another TED Talk topic that you'll be taking on?
I hope so. I have to first write the manuscript and then see.
Yes.
Let's see.
And what's the deadline for this book to be in?
We hope this book will be out by October of this year, which is National Diversity Month. So that's what we're hoping, October of 2019. But, it's in the process right now.
Well, that would be a well-timed release if you could schedule it to open then or to be released then.
Thank you.
Well, tell us about this, and I've heard your inspiring story of a little girl in India. Our listeners have not. Tell us about when you were a little girl growing up in India and what you aspired to be and become, and some of the barriers that you were facing.
So I was born the youngest of 4 girls, and when I was born, someone said to my father, "We are so sorry. We are so sorry that you had yet another daughter." And my father, my late father, he's not here anymore, but he's behind my shoulder when I speak every time. He said, "Give me your number and call me in 20 years. You tell me how your son's doing, and I will tell you how my daughter is doing." And that was the amazing blessing that I was born with. There's another piece to that story, Alan, which you may not know, is that my father himself was the object of reverse gender discrimination. He had a fabulous ear for music. He was very artistic, and he was very fond of history. And because in those days there were certain professions, he was forced into a career in science, technology, engineering, and math. And so when his daughters were growing up, he determined that there would be no should or shouldn't. They would follow the careers that they wanted to follow. And so that was because he experienced the opposite of what I have experienced, because he didn't want to do STEM and he was forced into STEM instead of the arts. So that's why I'm such a proponent of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math.
Well, just so you were born in India, educated in India, you lived in the United States how many years now?
32.
Okay. So is this as you look back on the history of your father and your own, would you say that the obstacles are more daunting in certain countries outside the U.S., or is this a global phenomenon that has to be dealt with in all societies?
So I was just looking at the United Nations does a global development report, and they look at the status of women and children all over the world, and they rank different countries. And in fact, you can look it up and see where your country ranks. They use different criteria. So I'd say the criteria are different, but some of the things, leadership of a country, socioeconomic status, the number of working women, the dollars equivalent of GDP of women who are working, the education rate. So there are multiple factors that impact all of that. I say that most countries, other than a few countries in Europe, have been doing extremely well in gender parity, but we have a long way to go. You just have different aspects of challenges, but it is as prevalent in multiple countries in Asia, many developed countries in Europe, as well as in America.
And you do speak around the world to audiences in all countries.
Yes.
And I've heard you talk about this being We Too.
Yes, hashtag us too.
Yes, hashtag us too, which I guess is a bit of a play on the Me Too movement, but dealing with a different topic. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I was actually not planning to write this mini book, hashtag us too, Bridging the Global Gender Gap, which just came out in 2018. But it is my response in the wake of the hashtag Me Too movement, is that I noticed that there was a lot of divisiveness. I noticed that the pendulum was swinging to where, it's not like all men are bad and all women are good. Absolutely, there's zero tolerance for people who have been perpetrators in the hashtag Me Too movement. At the same time, I am here speaking in all these platforms thanks to decent and honorable men and women men like my father, who encouraged my career at the beginning, my son, who has completely nurtured my career. And so therefore I wanted hashtag us to be a platform for women and men to work together to bridge the gender gap. So that was the perspective for hashtag us too.
Okay. So you've talked about your father a couple of times already. Tell us the story of how, when you told him what your ambition was and the barriers you were facing at school, tell us about what he did to move that process along in your favor.
I'm glad you asked that question, Alan. Very few people know that. So there I am in 8th grade. I think I'm about 12 years old, and I'm in an all-girls convent school run by nuns. And so the nuns came to me and they said, our advanced math teacher left, and so you're going to have to do biology because it's not worth it for 3 girls who want to study advanced math. And so I go home, I'm really sad, and I tell my parents. My father says nothing, but unbeknownst to me, he gets into his car and he drives to the boys' school that is just nearby, that is also run by Jesuit priests. And he has some kind of a conversation, and 1 week later, a male math teacher comes to our all-girls convent school run by nuns. There's like a huge furor everywhere. And in a little corridor, outside a classroom, 3 little girls sit at this table with this male math teacher for 3 years. Because I could do advanced math, I could take the entrance exam for IIT, which is a world-class engineering school in India. I got through the joint entrance exam. I entered IIT and just changed the course of my life. I was 16 years old. I looked up in IIT and there was me and 39 boys. And my question was, where are all the girls?
Now, IIT is the MIT of India, as I understand.
Yes,
Is that correct?
Yes, you're correct. Leslie Stahl did 60 Minutes on that, actually.
Yes.
You're correct, yes.
So, did you know the backstory of your father's being a victim of reverse gender discrimination when you were a little girl, or did that come much later in life?
That actually came up much later in life. I was, in fact, speaking at a conference at UTD, the local conference at UTD, and a young student asked me, she was like, what was it that made your father so different and unique from other parents in that time, in that location? And then I started examining it and asking my mother different things. I did not realize the place that he was coming from until very recently.
Ah. Well, that is so interesting and so inspiring. So the consequence of the lack of inclusion and the discrimination, of course, is that it can become self-limiting beliefs in the minds of those who are on the receiving side of this.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about these self-limiting beliefs that all of us, not only young girls, but that all of us become subject to based on our childhood and early adulthood, and how those can become not only childhood, but lifelong self-limiting beliefs?
So one of the things I did, Alan, I like that question because it talks about self-awareness. I got certified along the way in emotional intelligence. I believe self-awareness is absolutely critical to understanding our own beliefs. And one of the things that I do when we have large audiences, when I'm doing keynotes, is I have everyone stand up and I have everyone talk about how they reject the negative things that people have told them. Because a lot of times we believe these things that other people tell us. And then I have everybody stand up and say, I am enough. And so I would suggest if one is surrounding oneself with people that believe in you, not just as you are right now, but as you can be one day, that will go a long way towards understanding the self-limiting beliefs. And the other thing that I talk about is that we really want to have the success factors of grit, gravitas, and grace. I talk about that in both my TED Talks, but specifically in the most recent one, which is Common Ground on Gender Bias. If we don't uncover our own grit and gravitas, it's going to be very hard for us to succeed when people are limiting us by saying you shouldn't do this or this is as high as you can go.
So grit would be persistence and determination, I assume.
Yes.
And grace would be being able to be patient and deal with things as you're persisting. Is that what that would be?
So grace is kindness to yourself and to others. Usually we do grace as kindness to others. And, I was so blessed. I actually got to see Mother Teresa in person when I was a little girl in Calcutta many, many years ago. So she embodied grace to others, a living saint. But so often we're very hard on ourselves. So I suggest we have grace for ourselves and let ourselves be human. And grit, actually, that's an acronym. I love acronyms. Stands for G for guts, R for resilience, and I is indifference. Indifference to what other people say you should or shouldn't do or can or cannot do. And then T is for tenacity, just pulling yourself up and working hard and just going on.
And gravitas will be being serious enough about your goals to persist until you
Yes.
see them through to fruition.
Exactly. Gravitas is believing in the content of your own worth, in your subject matter, and not being all about fluff. I mean, when we look at how we talk in social media about little girls, so much of it just has to do with how pretty and how kind and delightful they are. As I'm collecting data points about little boys and little girls and asking people what does like a girl, like a boy, like a woman, like a man mean, I'm never hearing people saying kind is a word to describe like a man, which I
Yes.
believe is such a shock. I'm never hearing the word competitive to describe a little girl. It's always how kind and pretty and sweet they are. We are so much more than that. Both sides. Men are among the kindest people I know have been men. Among the most substance heavy, gravitas filled people have been women. But if all we talk about is how pretty someone is and how tough and strong someone else is, that is, I think, a recipe for disaster.
And especially if each of the genders accepts those
Yes.
stereotypes about themselves.
Yes.
We've all, particularly during our teenage years, been subject to bullying in one
Yes.
form or another. And I read something recently that, yes, that is true. However, the biggest bully of all is that bully in our heads.
That's right.
Those self-limiting beliefs that
Mhm.
we allow to drive our lives, that we allow to create futures for us that are less fulfilling than they otherwise could be.
I mean, that is such a profound statement that you made. Because honestly, if I look back at the 7 years and you were reading out this wonderful bio for me in the beginning, and a little voice inside me was saying, is that really you? Is that really you? Could that be true? And that's no matter what our age, we just have that little demon inside us saying, oh, no, you're not good enough. That can't be you. And who the heck are you? And so I suggest to every listener, uncover, I love that term that you use, uncover that bully inside your own head and just say, go lie down, or shut up, or do
shut
something
up.
else.
Right. Or here, take this in the mouth, right? So we've talked already about things being better. However, there are still significant gaps. Talk about the current workplace and the societal constraints and how the United States compares with others. I know you've already touched on that briefly, but since you speak around the world, talk about different parts of the world and what you encounter.
So first of all, I do want to say, because there are some people who say, oh, there isn't a gender gap. So let's just look at it in numbers. I try to do data harvesting and pattern recognition. So for the same job, there is something called equal pay day, which means that there's a date in April. So if a man in the same job has worked all the way through December 31st and got $1,000, then a woman in the United States would have to work all the way through a date in April to earn that same $100. And that sort of averages to between 86 to 88 cents on the dollar. That's the average of all demographics. If you slice it one more way with race and gender, it's really quite shocking. If you're an Asian woman, you probably earn 90 to 92 cents on the dollar. If you're an African American woman, you probably earn in the 60s. But if you're a Hispanic woman, you would earn 54 to 56 cents on the dollar.
In the United States.
In the United States. That's about half of the amount of money that the average would be for a man earning it. So this is a huge gap, which is intensified also depending on your ethnic background. So that's, to me, very eye-opening. And comparing to the gender gap in other countries, as you said that, I don't know if their documentation and the data collection is as robust in many countries. So it's very hard for me to compare exactly apples to oranges. But I would also say that in many countries, we use some simple metrics, such as the number of people in STEM professions, use the number of people in medical or healthcare fields, and those statistics, again, go to the United Nations Global Development Report. It is fascinating. And it's, to me, it was sort of ironic when I saw when they talk about groups at risk, women and children was listed as a group at risk. To me, that was just shocking.
So would it be correct to say that the so-called glass ceiling is not only the job itself, but it's also the pay for the same job. So a
Yes.
woman could crack the glass ceiling and become a chief executive or some other important role, and yet not be paid the same amount as her predecessor, who might be a man. Would that be correct?
That's an interesting question you ask. I have not heard that about women in C-suite positions and board positions, but that is a very good metric because really there is a dearth of women in C-suite positions and females in boards. There are some states, for example, California
Yes.
has where it's mandatory to have, in publicly traded boards would have at least one female. But these are sort of forced numbers. My hope is for a time when the pipe just keeps going all the way through, where a lot of women enter the profession as individual contributors, even go up to middle managers, and then they sort of get stuck and don't get roles as senior leaders moving onwards. So I think it's really important to watch where the point that the attrition or stagnation happens and to help men and women's careers progress equally. I think that's critical.
Okay. All right, let's segue to emotional intelligence. And I know you've briefly mentioned this already, but emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills are critical for all of us, regardless of gender. And I think it's fair to say it does apply to both men and women. Is it especially critical for women, in your view, given the current constraints that you talked about?
No, I don't believe that at all. I believe that emotional intelligence is important for all of us. And I think, in fact, based on that data that I'd mentioned of asking like a girl, like a boy, etc., I think if one's identity as a male is associated with being strong and tough and macho, I think it would be really interesting to uncover one's self-awareness and self-regard and how much is linked to that. Just as with females, it's critical for females to understand that sometimes being a people pleaser and apologizing a lot might reduce that gravitas I talked about, not just your self-worth or self-belief, but I think people behave the way we train them to. And so I would say emotional intelligence is absolutely the key to inclusive leadership, but it's critical for both women and men, just in different ways.
Well, as a man and having grown up with a lot of the stereotypes being taught, if you will, or at least observing those stereotypes that the man is to be tough and don't show vulnerability and so forth. Isn't that a constraint just in and of itself?
Absolutely.
To a man, whereas a woman being more nurturing probably than most men are, isn't nurturing a part of emotional intelligence or not?
No, nurturing isn't, and you are actually talking not just to a type A personality woman, but to a type A++ personality woman. And so I don't really have that much of that, nurturing piece to me. However, I know that is a stereotype right there, that women have to nurture and that men have to be strong and tough. I think, so emotional intelligence, the way that it is, it's self-awareness, it's interpersonal skills, it's decision-making abilities, it's how you respond under stress. Those are some of the aspects of emotional intelligence. And then overall, how you relate to problem-solving situations. And so nurturing doesn't really come into emotional intelligence. You can use emotional intelligence to nurture or not nurture someone. There are certain times when nurturing is absolutely the wrong answer. If someone is wallowing in, self-pity, then helping them and, doing stuff for them probably won't help them. So there are situations where nurturing helps, and there are situations where nurturing is absolutely not the answer. So I would say each person is individual. I do not believe that emotional intelligence is more important for across the gender spectrum, one person or the other.
Okay. So when you are consulting with a leader of a corporation or organization, do you talk to that person about their own emotional intelligence as well as the need to have an organization that is imbued with emotional intelligence?
Absolutely. What we do is I would go to that person. They do a self-assessment. I use the Reuven-Baron EQI. They do the self-assessment. I debrief them. Usually their whole leadership team goes through the self-assessment. It's confidential. I talk to each person one-on-one. And then without the numbers showing of how low or high different aspects are, I put up a chart which says, in your team, you have 2 people who are really low in empathy. You have 3 people who are very, very high in reality testing. You have some people who have terribly low self-regard. And so as a team, you're sort of really stabbing each other in the back. Here's how you can have your back and have a more inclusive leadership team. So that's kind of the way we use it. Each person has their own strengths and towering strengths, in fact, and also their own crosses to bear. So I think that's what I say, is that I don't think this one size fits all, men are strong, women are nurturing. I think that's sort of propagating the stereotype we're trying to shatter.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, let's wrap this up with talking a bit about your second book, the one Miserably Successful No More, and what you meant by that title. That's very intriguing to me.
Thank you. Yes, that's the one, you had mentioned. We were shocked. It reached #1 in Amazon in its category. Then it became an international bestseller. I talked about how you discover what is your passion or your mission in life. And it was interesting. I interviewed a lot of people who were highly successful physically and financially and who were miserable. And it turned out that they were subject to huge levels of stress. And I asked them what it was, and there was an acronym for STRESS. Some people were just worriers, some people worried about money, health, different things. And so Miserably Successful No More, it was a realization that I had that as an executive at PepsiCo, I had myself been miserably successful and not realized it. And after I got laid off and started thinking about what I want my mission and the rest of my life to be, and interviewed multiple people who have the trappings of wealth and power and are really miserable and empty inside. And so that's some tools and solutions as to how we use emotional intelligence, recognize our stress, reduce our stress, make adjustments, because we have one life to live. And they did a study, this nurse did a study in hospice of people just as they were dying and what were the top 5 regrets of people as they were dying. And one of the regrets was, I wish I had lived a life that was true to me. I wish I had the courage to speak up for what I stood for. And so that's kind of what Miserably Successful No More is, to assess where you are, what makes you miserable, and get on the path with this one life that you have to live, of reducing stress and doing what you were meant to do.
Well, I think that is a real challenge to any ambitious, aspiring man or woman, especially in the West, where bigger, better, faster, stronger is kind of the mantra, that you've got to push yourself to become not only successful, but to have all the material rewards that go with that, never realizing that the emotional balance and equilibrium don't come with that unless you figure out a way to factor those two into your life and achieve that kind of balance.
Yeah.
And I know we have numerous professions that require graduate degrees and very smart people to attain, that have very high drug abuse, alcoholism, and other things, which again are ways of dealing with stress without the natural way to deal with it. Well, Debjani, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I know that all of our listeners have been inspired by this incredible story of this little girl from India and the story of her father, who suffered reverse discrimination of his own type, but who stepped up when it mattered for his own daughter. That's really inspiring to hear. And you've seen your dreams materialize in ways even bigger than the ones you envisioned growing up. And now that's really something we can all aspire to. So that's it for this one. I will see you all on the Yellow Brick Road next week. And Debjani, thank you so much again for being on Exiting the A.S.A.P. Lane.
Thank you so much.